Yeah.
So I take
Jesse, I went ahead and started the live and recording.
Yeah. And I just send it.
Yeah.
I asked for a split issuance. All my sea time, all my.
Let's take the call.
Oh, right on time.
Hey, Nathan. How are you?
And do you think with my little skip, I give me your personal? Oh, yeah, I have the. Yeah. the last-
Jesse, I don't know if you saw Nathan Hall walk in, but he's here.
The last couple of years. So is that there? Actually, I was out on Sunday also called. It's another story.
Okay. Welcome. Let's call this meeting to get to order, please, of the Habitat Water Quality Standing Advisory Committee of the North Carolina Marine Fisheries Commission. I'm Doug Rader. Let's just take a minute, just go around and say your name if you don't mind, so we, for the record, and then we're gonna turn to Jesse, who's not able to be here tonight, for some information about meeting processes and other things. Again, I'm Doug Rader. Chair, Sarah,
Gardner, Vice Chair.
and Marine Fisheries Commission members.
Nathan Hall, UNC's Institute of Marine Sciences.
David Glenn with the National Weather Service over in Newport.
Mark Sonder, H2O captain.
Scott Leahy, Carter Community College, captain at large.
Lorena, I'm a biologist out of the manual office.
I'm Bennett, I'm a biologist in Morehead City.
Joe, biologist out of the Wilmington office.
My name is Hope Wade. I work in the director's office.
My name is Coral. I work in the commission office.
And welcome aboard, Paul.
Thank you.
And I'm Charlie Beaton, Habitat Protection Supervisor here in Morehead.
Great. So, Jesse, can I turn to you before I even go to the agenda?
Doug, I do believe we have 2 additional advisory committee members on the call if they would like to introduce themselves.
Yes, Lisa Ryder. I am a committee member and also the executive director for Coastal Carolina River Watch.
Thanks, Lisa.
And I'm Kate Arnold. I'm a recent graduate of UNCW, specializing in environmental science.
Thanks, Kate. Jesse, did you want to update us on meeting attendance and things?
I certainly can. So I'm Jesse Bissett. I'm the Marine Fisheries Commission liaison, and I apologize for not being able to be there in person. I'm unfortunately sick right now, but because I'm not there, y'all get to see Hope sitting up there in the front, which I was told earlier is better than me sitting there. So now not only am I sick, I also have hurt feelings, so that's nice. But anyway, the update that I have for the committee is we received some additional guidance from the Department of Justice on virtual participation in specifically advisory committee meetings. And since the recommendations from advisory committees are not binding recommendations, they did feel it was appropriate for advisory committees to allow virtual participation. So from now going forward, we can allow members to participate virtually as well as vote virtually. So the 2 advisory committee members who are on virtually tonight, y'all can vote.
I think that's good news, Jesse. It's kind of crazy to me to remember fully designated members who are present virtually not to be able to vote, so that's really great. Great, so, and we do not have the minutes for you this time from the last meeting in October. We will have those along with these to look at next time around. Sorry about that. So you have the draft agenda before you. Jesse, a question. Does that mean, do we still need to do roll call votes then of this body, or can we just do voice votes for things that are obviously, like approval of an amendment?
You can do voice votes if you would like to.
Okay, just making sure. I don't want to leave anybody else out of this. Great, so you have that agenda. Again, we'll be looking predominantly at the final steps of two fishery management plan adopted by the commission coming soon. This is basically our last bite at this version of this app. And so we'll be focused on those two things tonight. So having seen that draft agenda, is there a motion to accept it? Okay, by Scott. And if you don't mind saying your name this time, since Jesse's not here, is there a second? Second.
Mark Sauter.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. No discussion? Hearing none, the agenda is adopted. Move on to the first item on that agenda, which is invitation from staff on the Eastern Oyster Fishery Management Plan, Amendment 5.
Alrighty. As I stated earlier, my name is Bennett Paradis. I'm one of the co-leads for the Oyster Amendment 5 management plan. Joe over here is the other co-lead. So our presentation today is going to focus on reviewing the proposed management strategies within the current draft of Amendment 5. After we present these ideas, we'll open the floor for questions and further discussion. For perspective of where we are in the FMP process currently, this is a timeline. Back in July, we held a 3-day advisory committee workshop and incorporated those edits into this current version of the plan. The MFC has voted to send out this plan for review to you all. So this advisory committee is one of 4, which will review the draft of Amendment 5 to the Oyster Management Plan and vote on the recommendations proposed by DMF. Following the discussion and reviews held during these ACs, the MFC will then select preferred management options, and the draft of the amendment will be sent for DEQ secretary and legislative review. Tonight, the main discussion will be the issue papers and the preliminary management recommendation proposed by DMF. This stage in the process allows for further review and discussion of ideas for management strategies concerning oysters in North Carolina. Amendment 5 is comprised of a base plan that provides background information on the biology of oysters, a description of the fisheries, an economic impact summary, and an overview of the oyster resource as important habitat. There are also several appendices that provide further detail on DMF management policies and enhancement programs. The management strategies that are proposed in the recreational harvest issue paper and the mechanical harvest management issue paper are the topics we're going to focus on tonight, as these areas are where we have focused on revising in this amendment. So that's going to be Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. And I'll go into Appendix 1, which is the recreational shellfish harvest issue paper. The number of recreational shellfish harvesters in North Carolina is currently unknown, which makes it extremely difficult to estimate the total recreational harvest. This is an issue that has been acknowledged in all past Eastern oyster and hard clam plans. And there's an inability to accurately estimate the amount and extent of recreational shellfish harvest in the state. Due to the widespread accessibility of intertidal oysters and clams along North Carolina's coast, the potential impact of recreational harvest could be significant, resulting in a large data cap in Lanning's data. The division is striving to establish the best available data sources across the fishery to complete a stock assessment. Given that North Carolina's shellfish fisheries are exclusively under state jurisdiction, a lack of recreational harvest data makes it extremely difficult to address potential management issues, including harvest limits, size limits, gear restrictions for this fishery. North Carolina and Virginia are the only 2 states without some form of recreational license, local permitting, or residency requirement for recreational harvest. shellfish harvest. Another concern of not having a license requirement for shellfish harvest is the inability to easily communicate health concerns associated with harvest from temporary or permanently closed polluted areas. Shellfish harvest areas are highly regulated by shellfish sanitation section in NCDMF. The shellfish sanitation section is responsible for classifying all coastal waters as to their safety for shellfish for human consumption. Within coastal waters, areas are classified as approved, conditionally approved, restricted, or prohibited. These classifications are used to keep consumers healthy and safe. As no license is required for harvest, participants are often unaware of stipulations and/or closures and are unable to be targeted with educational material. However, having a separate license for recreational harvesters could automatically link to essential information updates on shellfish safety. Creating a specific recreational shellfish license or permit would provide NCDMF with a complete pool of recreational harvesters. That list could then be used as a survey frame to help determine the effort in the fishery, as well as the total harvest that occurs. This would allow for distribution of educational materials and information at the point of sale to any potential recreational harvesters. Additionally, having a list of the population of recreational harvesters would also be useful to help distribute closure proclamations and maps. If shellfish species get added to the already existing CRUFL, then the activity survey during the sale of the CRUFL would still need to be conducted to identify those fishers that participate in recreational shellfishing. And then those participants could be sent additional surveys to determine effort and harvest estimates for the recreational shellfish fishery. In order to pursue any one of these potential solutions, a significant amount of time and effort will need to be expended by DMF to assess internal program and resource capabilities, as well as any limitations. Any potential desired legislative changes require a specific process and are ultimately out of DMF or MFC control. To best solve this issue, DMF proposes that the division explore potential options and solutions outside of the fishery management process. So that's it for Appendix 1 for the recreational harvest issue paper. Next, we'll segue into the mechanical oyster harvest management, and I'll have Joe take.
You want to take questions in between or?
At the end. Yeah.
Just so here's a little background to kind of cover some kind of history of oyster management and their life history that's kind of pertinent to this. And there's a lot more information in the issue papers, the fishery management plan, and the coastal habitat protection plan. But to kind of keep it concise here, it's kind of really condensed. So if there's any more questions, feel free to bring them up at the end and we can clarify. And I have a ton of bonus slides here, so anticipating some questions. Oysters managed in North Carolina now, we don't have a stock assessment, so we're not managing them, kind of looking at kind of controlling fishery mortality rates, how we do other fish and shellfish species. But oysters are unique that they're not just a fishery resource, they're actually habitat, and they're their own habitat that they need to successfully reproduce. So you can think about it, when you harvest an oyster, you're not only taking an individual oyster that's capable of reproducing and making more oysters, you're actually taking the habitat that those young oysters need to be able to grow. So with that unique problem, we've focused our kind of historic and current management has been focused on managing oysters as a habitat to ensure that we still have oysters to harvest. We implement habitat protection measures to protect oyster habitat. So if there's oyster habitat, we have oysters. As long as we're not removing more oyster habitat, then it can naturally replace itself by growing shells, or we can supplement by planting culture material. We'll continue to have oysters to harvest. So kind of their oysters are a unique problem that they're not only the resource, they're actually their own habitat. So jumping into managing mechanical harvest of oysters, and this is mechanical harvest is only allowed in specific areas and seasons in the subtitle Oysters of Pamlico Sound. And our fishery management plan is again only addressing wild oysters. This appendix in the fishery management plan aims to address kind of three broad problems or issues. The first is addressing habitat impacts, so impacts to that oyster reef habitat from mechanical fishing gear, because oyster dredge, that mechanical gear, is a very efficient way to quickly remove a lot of oysters, and it has potential to be fairly negative to oyster habitat for both oysters and other organisms that depend on those reef habitats. And so through the Commission's Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, the division has been tasked with identifying ways to reduce impacts from those bottom disturbing gears. So in this appendix, proposing strategies to help mitigate some of those worst impacts. The second issue we're kind of looking at is addressing some concerns with our current mechanical harvest management strategy, issues that the fishery as well as the division have with kind of how it's operating. And the third issue we're looking to address is to how to better integrate the division's extensive culture planting program into our fishery management plan. So our existing strategy of how we manage mechanical harvest of oysters in Pamlico Sound aims to monitor oyster harvest in real time. So monitor those habitat conditions where mechanical harvest is happening. And then once the habitat in those mechanical harvest areas reaches a certain threshold, harvest is closed to prevent any further harvest and to stop any additional damage to the habitat. This was established in previous oyster plans with the goal of preventing excessive damage to those oyster reefs, to allow mature oysters to stay there and to provide substrate for new oysters to settle to. So making sure we stop mechanical harvest before the damage to the reef goes beyond a point where it'll be able to support additional oyster growth. So this is a kind of reactive approach, and the strategy is designed to monitor where the active fishery efforts occurring. However, when this strategy was adopted, participation was much higher. So in recent years, it's been harder for the division to actually get out there and monitor where the actual fishing efforts occurring. And additionally, when areas are closed, either due to the trigger or there's a gap in when the shallow bays can be open to mechanical harvest, there is no fishery effort occurring. So it's been hard for us to go out and actually find areas sometimes where there's actual fishing happening. And this results in the areas that we're sampling may not be representative of areas that are actually being fished. And so right now, the season length, so how long actual fishing is occurring, is determined by our trigger sampling. So the potential mechanical harvest season could run mid-November through March, but how long it actually runs by management area is really contingent on the conditions of the oyster resource in that area. And then, so depending on the results of our trigger sampling, an area can be closed by proclamation relatively quickly, and there's been high variability between years. Some years, mechanical harvest is open for 10 days, and then the following year can be open for 8 weeks. It really depends on the condition of the oyster resource in that area. And at the beginning of each mechanical season, harvesters are unaware of how long each area is going to be open, so they have to actively monitor those proclamations to see when we'll be closing those management areas. And this has led to kind of uncertainty for fishers that they're unhappy with. So those deep water oysters we're talking about in Pamlico Sound, some of those deep water reefs historically reached up to 13 feet off the bottom. But currently, these deep water reefs we see that below a certain point, so kind of deeper than 18 feet deep, we see these oyster reefs suffering mass mortality when there's low oxygen events. So we'll see there's a difference between the deep water reefs in those deeper areas that are lower than 18 feet. We'll see a lot of mortality during low oxygen events caused from hurricanes. Or you kind of look in the bays in those shallower areas, we don't see those impacts from hurricanes. And additionally, if those deep water reefs can reach a height off the bottom to get over those events with low oxygen, the oysters on the tops of those reefs, if they have a little higher relief, will survive. So kind of the long-term survival and recovery of these deep water reefs really depends on them being able to be over the level of where that low dissolved oxygen water is during storm events. And so there's been studies that have shown that the reefs in the Neuse River during a typical mechanical harvest season at the time see up to 1 foot of material removed during that mechanical harvest season. So at the beginning of the season, a reef could be this high and, that much material is removed. And you compare that to, although it's tough to kind of say how much an oyster reef can grow in a year because conditions, kind of the site conditions really play a strong role. But what we're seeing in our typical kind of culture planted sites, oysters will go from their first year to takes about 3 years to reach 3 inches long. So we're seeing about 1 inch a year an individual oyster grow compared to that potential 1 foot of removal in a season. So. So not only have kind of the height and conditions of the reefs been degraded through time, just the amount of reefs we have out there have significantly been reduced. So many of these high profile reefs that were documented in the 1800s, and we've gone back to look at them now, have either completely disappeared or been reduced to kind of shell rubble and very low profile. And overall, all the reefs that have been documented have shown decreases in height. And these declines in reef abundance and the declines in reef height have been attributed to decades, if not centuries now, of fishery effort. So this map here shows our culture planting sites. So areas where we go out and place hard material, whether it be shell or rock, for juvenile oysters to settle onto. So kind of to make up for some of that material that's removed, when we harvest oysters, we can replace that material with shell and rock as sites for those young larval oysters to settle onto and grow. But you can see all of the green boxes and yellow triangles focused around the perimeter in those shallow portions of Pamlico Sound. So there hasn't been any culture planting effort to kind of replace any material that's been removed through oyster harvest in those deeper portions of the sound. The good news is that our culture planting effort in Pamlico Sound in areas open to mechanical harvest has exceeded the amount of material removed through oyster harvest. So we're at least keeping on top of replacing material that's removed from Pamlico Sound through oyster harvest by adding shell and rock back into the sound. However, the areas we plant is restricted to areas without existing oyster. So it's not a direct one-to-one replacement on a reef. It's just kind of on the area scale of landscape scale of the sound. In those shallow areas, we're at least replacing the material that's being removed through oyster harvest. In particular, since 2018, 36 times more culch has been planted in Pamlico Sound than bushels of oyster harvested. And with that said, however, right now, how oysters are managed in Pamlico Sound, culch reefs and wild reefs are not differentiated between each other. So an oyster is an oyster as far as management is concerned currently, whether it comes from a culture planted reef or a wild reef. And so right here is a figure showing kind of the amount of oyster harvested, and it's that solid black line, versus the amount of culture we've been planting in the mechanical harvest areas of Pamlico Sound. So you can see, particularly in those recent years, when funding has really stepped up for the culture planting program, that we're really planting a lot of material compared to the bushels of oysters harvested. So potential management that's proposed in this appendix there's three strategies to address each one of those concerns: the habitat concern, the kind of fishery concern of how the fishery is managed, and of kind of adopting mulch planting program, incorporating it into our fishery management plan. So the first strategy we propose is deep water oyster recovery areas. And kind of the overarching strategy of these areas is that we prioritize for this management plan cycle the habitat value of those oysters over the fishery value of those oysters. Strategy 2 is culture supported harvest areas, and that's kind of how we manage things now. And we're just proposing a different means of establishing season lengths. And that strategy, both the habitat value and the fishery value are valued equal. And that third strategy is a rotational culture site strategy. In this strategy, we prioritize the fishery value of those oysters over the habitat value. So we'll go into that first strategy, the deep water oyster recovery areas. So as I discussed, those deep water reefs in Pamlico Sound, we've seen that they've suffered mass mortality. In our trigger sampling, since 2018, we saw very few live or legal oysters, and just kind of this year, we're starting to see oysters being an abundance of legal oysters on those reefs. So it's taken basically from 2018 until today to see recovery of oysters to legal size, and those areas are now currently open to harvest. We haven't done any culture planting effort out in those deep water areas, so any oyster that's removed there, if we're removing those oysters faster than they can naturally grow, we're going to have a net loss of oyster reef in that area. And so in the appendix, we identified 2 deep water oyster recovery areas, or DORAs, that include historical deep water reefs, where we propose mechanical harvest not be allowed until evaluation at the next fishery management plan. And for ease of enforcement, those deep water oyster area boundaries are based on existing navigational markers. So this first map here I could use this to drink some water. I'm not sure. Thank you. Thank you, computer.
Sorry, that took a minute.
That first map here shows the proposed deep water oyster recovery area in the Neuse River. And this is a condensed version of what was initially proposed during the advisory committee workshop. And when it first, we worked with them and got a lot of feedback. So we came up with something that was a little more condensed. And while that box looks big, the potential oyster habitat, so what potential oyster habitat is any hard bottom, whether it be shell or actual oyster reef that had been mapped since 1887 through 2007. And we know a lot of those areas are not actual living reef anymore, and what's reef may not be in the best condition, but just what represents potential oyster habitat in that box is 180.6 acres. So while the box looks pretty big, it really only is less than 1% of that total box is oyster habitat or potential oyster habitat in that area. And the same thing for the Pamlico River deep water oyster recovery area that's proposed in the issue paper. This box, again, a very big box, but the potential oyster habitat in there only makes up around 3% of that total box. So what we're asking is just to protect that 3% of that oyster habitat in there So this strategy, the Deepwater Oyster Recovery Area Strategy, kind of the goals of this strategy would be to reduce gear disturbance to allow those natural oyster reefs in there to grow and recover. So right now, a lot of those reefs are just kind of loose shell hash. And so as those reefs recover, it's not only beneficial for the oysters to gain height and complexity, but for all the other organisms that rely on those oyster reefs, many of which are commercially important species, such as crab, shrimp, other finfish. And that kind of the long-term goal of this would be to evaluate the effectiveness of these closure areas to potentially open for future sustainable harvests. And that would be, again, for the life of this plan, we're proposing that the Deepwater Oyster Recovery areas not have mechanical harvest, and then be evaluated at a future plan. And we can use varying metrics to kind of evaluate the success of these. Probably the easiest would be side scan sonar to kind of look at reef height, hardness. We could do abundance and population studies using scuba gear. And as an example of this, both Chesapeake and Maryland, they had area closures, and it took them about 15 years before they opened back up to harvest, but now they support significant wild harvest after they closed those areas and opened them up. And so what kind of future harvest could look like, don't know, and how that would be managed. That's kind of for a future plan, but the overall goal is to close them now to allow recovery to occur. So strategy 2 is the culture supported harvest areas. And again, that's kind of how we manage right now. And you can see, as you saw by those maps, there has been significant culture planting efforts in the bays of Pamlico Sound. So in those shallow areas, we've been putting a lot of material in there. The proposed areas that are to be managed under the strategy, we aim to encompass all the culture sites that we planted. And we're not proposing any change in bushel limits, area, seasons. So same bushel limits, the same management areas, same season lengths, everything from the previous plans will move forward, except we're proposing to replace the current trigger monitoring program with a mechanism of creating fixed season lengths by area. So this would allow for more certainty for fishers, and we would base that off of the condition of the oysters in that area. So kind of just a broad look at how this would work. One of the main concerns of the fishers right now, how we manage, is that we may not be sampling areas that are representative of where they're fishing. So built into this strategy is a mechanism to get industry reports right off the bat. So whether it be probably to be an email address, phone number, someplace where 24 hours a day, fishermen can direct us, kind of leave us a message of where we should be sampling. And so those preseason reports from the industry will inform where we go out and do our preseason sampling. So we'll go out and do preseason sampling. We'll look at the condition of the oysters by area. We'll set a season length, and that's based on the past trigger sampling we've done. There's a lot more information kind of how we got to that in the issue paper. But basically, in previous years, how long it took a management area to reach that 26% legal from where it started. So if it started at 56 and it took 7 weeks to get to 26, kind of the season length would be set at 7 weeks. And there's a whole table, and it kind of shows how we got there in the appendix. So we then, as a division, issue the proclamation, really explaining what the season by area would be. The season would open up. The industry would know, okay, we have 6 weeks to go. We would ask them for in-season industry reports for kind of where they're fishing in season and where we should do our next round of sampling. We go out and do an in-season sampling, look at that, see, are we progressing how we thought we would, or we did 3 weeks get us halfway through the season? If not, if it looks like, we've way underestimated how long it would take, we can modify that season and make it longer based on that table that's in the issue paper. And if not, it looks like it's dead on, then the season length stays. So kind of just as a way for us, the division, to give more certainty to the fishers while still maintaining the level of habitat protection we have now with our sampling program. And that the third strategy we propose are creating these large rotational 10-acre culch sites. So currently the culch planting program has already implemented a rebuilding strategy to create large 10-acre planting sites in areas open to mechanical harvest. So if you look at the map, the black lines are our management area boundaries. So the northernmost one, we have Dare, Hyde, Pamlico, and New River management areas. And so the goal is to have 4 of these 10-acre sites in each one of the management areas. So you can see right now the red dots are what we already have constructed. And then by 2026, we'd have all 16 sites constructed. And 16 sites are what we can commit to now based on funding. But if this is a strategy that works well and funding continues, we may be able to expand this beyond those 16 sites. But right now, for the scope of this plan, we're proposing 16 sites. And how it would work is 1 site per management area would be open for the season. So a site would get planted, be closed to harvest for 3 years, and on that 4th year open, allow harvest, and then close down for 3 more years, and then be allowed to harvest again on that 4th year, so year 8. And so after harvest, if it needed to have culch replenishment, they could plant more culch material in there to kind of rebuild anything that was removed and allow harvest again. So at any given year, there would be 4 sites open, 1 in each area, and these would be open for the full potential season, so not subject to those season lengths that we would set in strategy 2. So from mid-November all the way through March, they'd be open regardless. Just there's areas guaranteed to be open no matter what. And they're all in the 15 bushel areas as well. And then so one last piece here that's relevant to that second strategy is the adaptive management that's proposed. And in that second strategy of how we create those fixed season lengths, that was based on the data we collected between the 2017-2018 season and the 22-23 season, actually the 23-24 season. And that's kind of represents a period of effort where it's kind of the participation in that fishery kind of stabilized or remained relatively similar compared to earlier years like 2010-11, it was much higher. And so our season lengths are based on kind of that amount of effort from that participation. And so if participation changed wildly, so the average number of participants was 93. And so if it changes 25% either way, either 25% more people jump in to that fishery, so more than 116, or less than 70, if 25% people drop out, those fixed season lengths that we created that are in that table may not be adequate anymore. They either may be way too conservative, and if people drop out of the fishery, that the resource could sustain more fishery effort, or if a lot more people jump in, they may not be conservative enough because the resource potentially could not support that much effort. So basically the adaptive management framework just asked that if we hit any of those participation triggers, that the division would go back in and reevaluate those season lengths based on the data we have. That's just basically kind of a fail-safe measure in here if participation really changes sometime between when this plan's adopted and the next plan is open. So with that, the preliminary division recommendation for that first appendix, the recreational harvest issue, the division's preliminary recommendation is to support, I guess, have the commission support the division to further explore potential options and develop a solution to quantify recreational shellfish harvest participation in landings, and to establish a mechanism to provide all recreational shellfish harvesters with shellfish sanitation and water quality, health, and safety information outside of the fishery management plan process. The division's recommendations for Appendix 2 mechanical harvest. For that first strategy, the initial recommendation from the division is to adopt the deep water oyster recovery areas as outlined in the issue paper. For strategy 2, culture supported harvest, is to adopt proposed culture supported harvest strategy as outlined in the issue. And for strategy 3, it's to adopt the rotational culture site strategy. And for mechanical harvest, the adaptive management, the division's initial recommendation is to adopt the adaptive management framework. And again, that only applies if the proposed culture supported harvest strategy management 2 is implemented. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you and we can.
I noticed on the agenda, we really only got like 20 minutes laid out for the hard clam presentation. Is that correct? And so we got public comment on at 6:50. I don't know if anybody's actually on and planning to comment or not. Or Judge Tom. Just for my information. Yeah.
So Doug, I think we do have one member of the public that wants to speak, and the way we've done it at the other AC meetings, even though we're a little behind on time, we'll have this first presentation, any questions specific to the presentation from the committee members, and then move on to CLAM, and then kind of the same thing. If there's any questions specific to the presentation from the AC members, we can ask them then, and then move into public comment. But it's entirely up to y'all how you want to handle it.
If that doesn't violate any norms, then we'll do it that way, Jesse. Great. So questions then. Eastern Oyster Plan as you've heard presented. And we'll come back, we'll have discussion on recommendations later. The questions about what you've heard.
Go ahead. I have one question. So the strategy 2, so if it looks like you're gonna meet the harvest goal, or if you're not gonna meet the harvest goal in the time that you said you're gonna do it, you extend the season. But if it looks like you're gonna meet it early, do you shorten the season? And if that's the case, how is that addressed in uncertain?
So as written now, it does not shorten the season. So that first proclamation stands partially because just of that. So it guarantees that certainty for that period. And we're hoping that the fixed season lengths are effective.
All right, for you. I think early on you said, talk about the stock assessment. Do we, for the statewide, have a oyster stock assessment?
Yeah, and part of the push for a recreational permit license, that would, alleviate some of the data gaps that are necessary for a stock assessment. So it's kind of a step towards getting there.
So just for instance, and not trying to anticipate where we're going, but we might recommend that all of the key data gaps be identified and filled, including this one, on the pathway towards having a first and then repeated stock assessment for oysters and for hard clam. And so the recommendation to us is consistent with that. And I do think that that's appropriate. I will, again, this is my personal opinion, is that we talked a lot about oyster habitat value for oysters, and we saw on the slide the oyster habitat value for other species. So I don't think it's beyond the pale to think about a future, not just a stock assessment, abundance or biomass goal, or spatial coverage goal, or spatial coverage goal of reefs high enough to sustain oysters and other species above the dead water zone under those kinds of conditions, some amount that we could embark upon a process to get there. We're not there now. And that's the first thing that always comes to my head when I look at those maps from the 1880s and say, here's what we had, here's what we've got today. It's a diminishingly small percentage of that. If we're going to set goals for where we want it to be through the CHIP and every other state plan, then what would they be? And so we would need some. Any comment on that since we're.
So yeah, I think as a division, we definitely our goal is to get somewhere closer to a stock assessment, or at least have some sort of abundance triggers in there. So for intertidal, for instance, they started a pilot sentinel site monitoring program, and that'll be a good source for fisheries independent data for the southern region for intertidal oysters. But for Pamlico Sound, I think whatever our trigger sampling program now doesn't collect data we need to kind of get at those abundance estimates, but it can be modified. And so that's the goal of kind of this next iteration. The issue paper really doesn't kind of prescribe how we're going to do the data collection as much as it did in kind of the last time it was set up, but it just kind of prescribes how we're going to use the data. So however we go, our next step here is to kind of address our sampling to better get some of those abundance estimates in Pamlico Sound.
Lisa or Kate, do you have questions? I can't tell if there's hands up.
None right now. I actually had a similar question that was just answered, so thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Kate? No?
On my end too.
Okay. Well, I'll ask it. Okay, Mark?
I have a few questions, if that's okay, some of them very easy. Please, this is based on what you had just told us about the low dissolved oxygen events. Besides storms, which you would almost think would churn things up and put more oxygen in the water, can you share with us some examples of these low oxygen events that are hurting the oyster streams?
So it's not so much the churning from the storm, but all the runoff, whether it be agricultural, residential, just bringing all those nutrients into the sound.
Yeah, straight ahead. Okay, I thought that's where we were going. And just turn me off when you want to go. Okay. Since you don't have this data from the recreational harvesters, why would you open up the deep water oyster habitats to something that we don't know at this point?
So right now, essentially, if it's not closed due to human health concerns, you could recreationally oyster within the season anywhere. So you could recreationally oyster there now if you wanted to. It would take a pretty good amount of effort, and I don't foresee a lot of people doing it, but it's always an option.
Even without knowing how much is taken or how many people are taking it?
Yes, so for that recreational aspect, the major concern for me is the intertidal areas that are really accessible. And I mean, it's allowed now and we have no idea.
But Mark, I heard your question to be related to the issue of whether the deep water recovery areas might even be open later. And
Yes.
And that was that decision was delayed without judgment about whether or not they would. Again, my own personal view would be establishing goals for those things, and probably on the early days, your first such closed areas would need to be well protected and maintained. And so you wouldn't necessarily, because the other habitat values, irrespective of oysters, probably wouldn't want to be opening those up to mechanical or brick.
Yeah, clearly, without the data
Right.
behind it.
But we'll have a chance to weigh in on those issues. So for now, they would be closed until some action were taken later to allow them to be opened under the aegis of a later fishery management plan. That's the way I heard it. Is that correct?
And specifically in what we're proposing is no mechanical harvest. So in theory, if you wanted to dive down there and hand harvest commercially or recreationally, that's still a possibility. We have, numbers on hand harvest for Pamlico Sound is really low in the areas where it's pretty easy to do so. So I can't imagine that's going to be the next big thing. But again, the way it's written now, it doesn't protect a deep water oyster recovery area, wouldn't protect it from hand harvest commercially or recreationally.
So just to elaborate the question, what about the other bottom disturbing fishing?
Right now, it's just addressing oyster mechanical harvest because that gear is targeting, I mean, the whole goal of oyster mechanical harvest is to remove oysters from those reefs. So our initial feelings is that other bottom disturbing gear is probably not, I mean, it's not, that is not as impactful as oyster mechanical harvest and probably not, you know, that impactful, especially hearing that, you know, people are actively trying to avoid certain areas to protect their gear. So, but again, that could be.
It's a question if you want to talk about it, whether there are, because the way this is packaged within the oyster plan, it begs questions about non-oyster fishing, but also non-fishing threats to the habitat value. Those are all fair questions.
Yeah, that was one of my questions as well, the relationship when oyster season is open in full, the relationship with the other marine life in that ecosystem, and how does it affect that other marine life? Because we're not just looking at one animal, we're looking at a whole system.
So yeah, the more relief and complexity an oyster reef has, typically it offers more benefits to other organisms, whatever fish and birds, compared to a degraded reef. And I kind of skipped over that.
Yeah, slide 21. So part of the door is that there would be an indirect ecosystem benefit. So the NOAA office in Chesapeake Bay, they did a study where they saw that there was significantly greater biomass and commercially available or commercially valuable fish and crabs on mature oyster reefs versus, you know, those that had been dredged recently or had low relief.
My memory of that Lenahan and Peterson paper is that it also showed very clearly that increased habitat value of the higher reefs and the loss to non-oyster habitat, oyster and non-oyster habitat value to degradation or erosion, vertical erosion of reef structure. So,
yeah, all those small things that can't easily get away can climb up the reef.
Instead of being either dying or being eaten, which are the two choices with that.
Which brings us to some, I guess, recent history. In Virginia, they had that 15-year closure before they reopened it. What was the findings in that 15 years? And can we learn from that of what was done to our neighbor to the north?
So I don't know the condition they went into that closure with. I don't want to hazard a guess that it was better than what we have, but it may have been. But they do extensive sampling prior to setting the season, and it's also managed on a quota. So they basically set the quota for a biomass target that can be removed, allow that to be removed, area closed, and then potentially rotational. So then that'll sit for X amount of years and then move to the next one. So that kind of what we're proposing now with the rotational cull strategy is kind of dipping our toes in the rotational approach and then seeing how that goes and potentially expanding in a future FMP.
So would there be value in you guys speaking with the people in Virginia as opposed to trying to, as you just said, put your toes in the water and see what happens? If we have a 15-year history, albeit a little bit north of here, to have open discussions with them and see their results. and how we may be able to do that or not do that.
I think a lot of it is just, I think viewing this as an incremental step, like this is step one. So if say this was adopted, the deep water oyster recovery areas is step one in some future management. The immediate need is to allow the reef to recover. And then, you know, step two would be future management goals, anything, but the bare basic kind of need at the moment is the allowing recovery out there. And then kind of the second portion is being able to, I guess, do the best with what we've got. That's like kind of the crudest way of.
I see this as a pilot project, honestly, in trying, I think they have used the experience in Chesapeake Bay and other places to propose this to us, that these things do come back when they're managed appropriately and sited in the right places. And so let's go try. And so this is a first trial of the idea. They'll look at both the plus and minuses, notice what worked, what didn't work. If there were threats that weren't identified, I think that were noticed and documented. But when they come back, you know, that will feed into the second iteration. And I would hope along the way we would also say that we ought to have 3 times as much, or you know, I mean, some idea directionally about how these 3 pieces of the puzzle come together. You know, the rotational mulch and well, all 3 pieces that we've heard about.
Of course, why have a trial if Virginia has already put some of those things on trial already?
Well, I know, but there's a lot of differences.
No doubt.
There to here.
Yeah.
And they've got, in my view, again, I have looked at this for a long time. I expect they've done as good a job as we could expect them staff to do on identifying the starting point in the places where reefs are most likely to be able to develop, redevelop high relief under the conditions that currently exist. And so I don't think that we have a choice but to try. For instance, if we tried to go way bigger than this without that evidence of what it might be, what to expect here, the commission wouldn't be able to understand the trade-offs. And I think this pilot allows us to understand the trade-offs.
May I have one more thought?
Sure, absolutely, please.
And I don't mean this in a humorous way, although it may come out that way. So the best thing for a reef is to have more shells there, and so that it can, the ecosystem within the oyster family can grow. And there are a lot of states that are trying to do what we're trying to do all along the eastern seaboard in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's all with the eastern oyster, which, as it turns out, for the most part, is essentially the same species. And there are some states that are buying up the used oysters mainly down from the Gulf of Mexico. And I realize our state, North Carolina, doesn't necessarily have that money to compete, which is why we're looking at other materials to use. So I'm old enough to remember when you would have a can of soda or a bottle of soda, that you would return it and get a nickel or a quarter, depending on the size. Might we think about a return policy of already, with the meat taken out of it, already used oysters, bringing it back to wherever, that's all a logistical nightmare in itself, to be able to use again to help replenish the oyster ecosystem. Again, I know that may sound a little funny, but I throw that out since no doubt there's a lot of oyster shells out there that are just being not used again, let's put it that way. So repurpose them for the purpose that they were meant to be.
Yeah, and we used to have a shell recycling program, but due to funding, that program was cut. I will say that the Coastal Federation, we've collaborated with them on building several oyster sanctuaries. They are looking further into tackling the logistics, and the funding that would be required for a statewide shell recycling program. I don't know the extent of if there would be some kind of rebate that you were suggesting. That is kind of up to
I'm not
them.
sure either.
That's like their research at the moment, but that is in development.
Could the funding come from licenses and permits? For recreational, which at this point is zero, so even making it $5 is $5 a
Usually
year.
the cost of developing and administering this program.
Of course.
So it is. Doesn't leave a lot of great.
Okay, thank you.
But I understand that the market for the oyster shell, the type you're talking about, is stiff. The competition is
Very.
and a lot of people are going here for oyster replenishment. And that there are some of the things you might think about are then not legal, the way, even constitutional, the way I understand it, under U.S. jurisprudence. So for instance, I don't think North Carolina could put in place a prohibition on the export of shells. But if we could, then that would actually take a market away, high-end market away from fishermen that want to sell live oysters to the market wherever it exists. There's all kinds of complicated social and economic cascades that get unleashed when you start thinking about mandating certain parts of that system. And I agree with the idea, which is to try to find a way to short circuit export of shells from North Carolina. If there was a way to create not regulatory foot necessarily, but payment that would return the shells or something.
Thank you, Doug.
No, I think that's a good idea, and we ought to think about it. Other questions or comments here before we move on to Oyster Hard Club, and then we'll come back to think about what we want to recommend to the commission.
I have a question. You mentioned the mass mortality events in the Deepwater Reef. When did they happen and what? Why?
So the last major one was 2018 Hurricane Florence and then Matthew, or whatever order that happened in. Florence and Matthew, yeah, were kind of the two major ones. And then we hadn't seen, I mean, it took years after that to actually see, there was a lot of spat and then kind of not much. And then it took until this year to really start seeing any abundance of legal size oysters out there in certain areas.
Is that mainly because of DO, or is that like silt and other stuff covering up the witch?
So in the Deepwater Reefs of Pamlico Sound, the primary, I think, cause of mortality environmental wise is from DO. And I think, and then those shallow bays, it's a different story where they're not dissolved oxygen events, but that's where the siltation's more of a problem.
The only thing I wanted to add or ask about, and maybe I'm beginning at the wrong time, but starting December 1st for fin fishers, there's a mandatory harvest reporting that's coming out. And you know, it's red drum, flounder, spotted trout, gray trout, striped bass. Why don't we have oysters and hard clams added to that? If you have to have a recreational license.
I think the director would probably kill it.
Well, I mean, it seems logical to me, but that's in one brain.
It's been written in.
Well, in the law, but he's suggesting that there's nothing to stop this advisory committee from recommending to the commission that a mechanism to keep track of whatever governance opportunities exist, licensing and otherwise, to get that information ought to be pursued aggressively. If somebody makes a motion, I'll support it.
And I will clarify that the divisions, basically what we're asking for in that issue is the commission's blessing to go forth and turn over every rock. So whatever mechanism we can come up with, whatever is the best way for us to do it, we want direction to do that and kind of backing from the commission, because you know, any sort of license change is probably it will require legislative action, and we could potentially do a permit, but that gets complicated for us administering, and that may also require, in the end, legislative action. So it's a spidering process once you start digging in, but I think we're looking for just that direction to, yes, go do this from the commission.
And I'll just, for the record, I'm a bit concerned about the potential for other bottom disturbing gears. If oyster reefs now are no more than 1% of those areas, creates a lot of opportunity for both gear interactions with areas that we're trying to grow and even accidents. So that's something to think about, the vulnerability to restoration caused by other threats, not just fish. Something. Okay, why don't we move on then, following Jesse's slight adjustment on the agenda to have a presentation on Park Clam. Questions, and then we'll take comment, and then we'll come back to the vote.
All right, good evening, advisory committee members. My name is Lorena De La Garza, one of the CLAM co-leads. Jeff Dobbs isn't here today, but he is the other CLAM co-lead. I will talk briefly on some key points from the hard clam base plan, and then we will be focusing on the mechanical harvest issue paper and preliminary DMF management recommendations. For your reference, this is where we are in the FMP development timeline, the same as oyster. And we're here today for the advisory committees to review and receive public comment on draft amendment 3. As I mentioned, I'll go over the goal and objectives for hard clam and a characterization of the fishery, an overview of Appendix 1, which is the clam mechanical harvest issue paper, and preliminary DMF recommendations. The goal and objectives for Amendment 3 were adopted at the November 2023 MSC meeting. The goal of the North Carolina Hard Clam FMP is to manage the hard clam resource, to provide long-term harvest, and continue to offer protection and ecological benefits to North Carolina's estuaries. Appendix 1 of the Clam Mechanical Harvest Issue Paper addresses Objective 2, which is to manage hard clam harvesting gear use to minimize damage to the habitat. Currently, the available hard clam data comes from commercial landings, fish house sampling, and a recreational survey of truffle holders. The recreational survey does not provide data for the entire recreational clam fishing population, as you do not need a recreational license to harvest clams in North Carolina. Without complete recreational data, we cannot accurately estimate total removals. This issue was discussed earlier during the oyster presentation, but it's a shared issue between both plans. This graph here shows North Carolina commercial hard clam landings and trips from public bottom from 1994 to 2022. Landings and participation have been in steady decline across the entire time period, mainly due to market demand. Our focus today will be Appendix 1, which is the clam mechanical harvest issue paper. Habitat concerns associated with bottom disturbing gears have been an issue with mechanical clam harvest since its inception. The management of this fishery has always been a balance between these concerns and the value of the fishery. Objective 2 of this amendment specifically directs management action to minimize habitat damage from clam harvesting gear. The number of participants and trips in the mechanical clam fishery on public bottom has steadily declined since the 1990s to the lowest levels on record, drawing the habitat versus fishery value balance into question. In addition to the significant resource required from the state to manage and monitor mechanical clam harvest, the division believes that the habitat value may now outweigh the value of the fishery. This has caused the division to re-examine the mechanical clam fishery. One of the primary concerns with mechanical clam harvest is the damage this harvest method can cause to habitat. Bottom disturbing gear, which include dredges and trawls, cause physical damage to clams and their habitat. Soft bottom habitats have also historically been considered the most appropriate location to use bottom disturbing gear. However, organisms living in this habitat and adjacent habitats can be harmed by these gears. The mechanical gear used to harvest clams are escalator dredges and clam trawls. Current fishery regulations prohibit the use of mechanical gear on SAB beds and live oyster beds and is only allowed in designated harvest areas because of the destructive capacity of the gear. Another habitat concern is sedimentation, as mechanical gear can create significant turbidity issues. Bottom disturbing gear can have negative impacts on clam beds and oyster reefs directly and indirectly. Direct effects include the physical damage caused by the gear, and indirect effects include the resuspension of sediment. High levels of suspended sediment can reduce successful settlement of larval clams and oysters and can smother shellfish by clogging their gills. These two maps depict two mechanical clam harvest areas, North River on the left and Bogue Sound on the right. From 1981 to 2021, a series of studies were conducted to map SAV beds across the state. The SAV maps generated from these studies were then overlaid onto the mechanical clam harvest area maps to look for areas of SAV overlap. The mechanical clam harvest areas were then adjusted to eliminate overlap and provide a buffer. An example of this overlap and area modification can be seen on the figure on the left of North River, where the red dotted line shows the new southern boundary line. On the right, the Bogue Sound clam mechanical harvest area. On the right is the Bogue Sound mechanical harvest area, Due to the large extent of overlap, this mechanical clam harvest area has been closed, and these changes occurred after Amendment 2 in 2017. This is a graph showing mechanical clam landings from 1994 to 2022, shown with the gray bars. This also includes the number of participants in the fishery, depicted by the black line. Harvest during this time period peaked in 1995 at over 8.7 million clams, and then declined to less than 100,000 clams since 2017. Participation mirrored a similar decline, with 138 participants in 1996, then declining to less than 10 each year since 2017. This figure shows which water bodies account for a majority of the landings from 1994 to 2022 using mechanical gear. Mechanical clam harvest landings have been dominated by two water bodies, the New River, shown in yellow, and Core Sound, shown in gray. Enforcement and maintenance of the designated mechanical clam harvest boundaries require substantial resources from the state. Each year, division staff marks all the mechanical clam harvest area boundaries with posts and signs to ensure enforceability of these boundaries. Staff replace all missing or damaged posts and signs that are affected by weather or vandalism. Additionally, Marine Patrol officers are required to monitor and enforce these areas. In Core Sound, the vast area that's open to mechanical clam harvest, along with its zigzagging boundary, makes enforcement difficult and resource intensive. The last piece of background that I'll go over is the allowance of mechanical harvest permitted prior to maintenance dredging. Through rule, the division allows the mechanical harvest of clams before maintenance dredging occurs in some navigational channels. The purpose of this rule is to allow commercial fishermen to access a resource that would otherwise be destroyed during the maintenance dredging process. This process requires collaboration between fishermen, the division, and Army Corps of Engineers. This rule hasn't been utilized since 2007, primarily because of the complicated process and limited interest. Now shifting into the socioeconomic analysis for this issue paper. Here's a table showing annual economic contributions from the mechanical clam commercial fishery for the last 11 years. From 2012 to 2022, ex-vessel values have varied from a high of approximately $285,000 in 2012 to a low of approximately $19,000 in 2020. The industry expanded in 2021, but has not returned to pre-2016 landings or participation, which has steadily declined over the period. Each year, the division uses a large number of staff and resources to monitor, manage, and enforce the fishery. These resources may be difficult to justify for a fishery with such diminished value. State resources may be better used to fund projects more beneficial to the clam fishery as a whole. In the background, we discussed mechanical clam harvest prior to maintenance dredging. So if the mechanical clam harvest fishery on public bottom were to be discontinued, it's necessary to end the exception for mechanical harvest in conjunction to maintenance dredging as currently allowed by rule. This would further benefit the habitat by reducing the extent of turbidity issues associated with mechanical piers. Again, this program has not been utilized since 2007. So I will now move into possible management options. Status quo would allow the fishery to continue to operate as it currently does. This would allow for the continuation of a historically significant fishery that provides important supplemental income to some users. The fishermen currently operating the fishery could continue and new harvesters could join. State resources for demarcation and enforcement would remain the same. Concerns about effects of bottom disturbing gears on structured habitats would not be addressed. Another option is to further limit mechanical clam harvest areas to improve enforceability and lessen habitat effects. This could be done by having boundary lines based on permanent structures and more rectangular in shape to also help with line of sight visibility. This was done in North River, displayed here. Modified boundaries also create buffers around critical habitat to protect them from sedimentation associated with bottom disturbing gears. As with status quo, the fishermen currently operating the fishery could continue and new harvesters could join. State resources for demarcation would be reduced, but the resources required for enforcement would likely remain the same. This would help address habitat concerns, but sedimentation would still occur for mechanical harvesting operations. The next management option would be a phase out of the mechanical clam fishery. Due to the requirements of the general statute listed here, the mechanical clam fishery cannot be ended abruptly upon adoption of this amendment. Outlined in the statute, an immediate closure of this fishery could result in severe curtailment of the usefulness or value of the equipment in which fishermen have any substantial investment. Additionally stated in the statute, this would require a future effective date as to minimize undue potential economic loss to fishermen. The mechanical clam harvest fishery could be phased out over a set time frame, as was done with the shellfish relay program. This option would allow, this option would allow fishermen currently operating in the fishery to continue during the phase out period and may discourage new participants. The phase out period would allow current mechanical harvesters time to get rid of gear and transition to other clam harvesting methods or fisheries. This option would allow the division's address the division's resource concerns with demarcation and enforcement, as well as the habitat concerns. Regardless of the phase out, mechanical gear can still be used in the private sector. After hearing concerns from the Fishery Management Plan Advisory Committee about participants wanting the ability to reenter the fishery, the division recommends a phase-out timeframe of 3 years from adoption of this amendment, unless landings increase to at least 1 million clams and participation increases to at least 10 participants in the fishery in any year prior to 2027. 10 participants have not been active in a single year in the fishery since 2017. In 2022, there were 3 participants. The fishery last landed over 1 million clams in 2014. And in 2022, less than 200,000 clams were landed. This increase in landings and participation would show that the fishery is no longer diminishing and is valuable enough to maintain. This is a timeline if both triggers are met in any single year prior to 2027. This timeline would comply with the general statute. If the triggers are met, the issue would be brought back to the MFC for consideration at the May 2027 business meeting, or when participation and harvest estimates from 2026 are available. If the triggers are not reached, the phase out would be complete in May 2028. The phase out period gives fishermen 3 years to sell their gear and transition to other clam harvesting methods or fisheries. The last management option to be considered is discontinuing the allowance for mechanical clam harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging. This would end a program that has not been utilized since 2007. This would require a rule suspension, and this option could be pursued on its own or in conjunction with the phase out of the fishery mentioned previously. The division recommends two options. They recommend the phase out to be completed 3 years from the adoption of this plan unless the fishery participation and landing triggers discussed previously are met, and to discontinue the allowance for mechanical clam harvest in conjunction with maintenance dredging. These management options would only affect mechanical clam harvest from public bottom and would not affect their use on private bottom. Mechanical clam harvesting gear can still be used in the private sector. And that is all that I have, and we'll open it up for questions.
Questions for Lorraine?
I have two. When you say mechanical gear under clam harvesting, I know that like pump dredges, obviously is the primary. Does that also lead to rakes of, I mean, you said it's not recreational for this. Commercial only, and could the commercial fishermen switch over to a rake type harvesting gear?
As long as it's not mechanically powered.
Yeah, my other question is with the 10 commercial fishers / 1 million clams, is that an and or is that both?
Both.
Okay.
Just for context, do you know the number of clams harvested from least bottom in North Carolina per year versus 1 million and 8 million?
How much are harvested from leases?
Roughly. Should know better.
I don't have the exact numbers. But I can come up with something.
Okay. Yeah. Just for scale. And this plan does not address that at all.
Yeah, just public.
Other questions?
I was curious, you mentioned that not allowing the harvest of the clams after the maintenance dredging would reduce the turbidity, and I just was trying to figure out how that works. Like if we're stirring up the dirt to dredge, how does it not taking the clams reduce?
Well, it hasn't been used since 2007. Just the coordination of it all with Army Corps of Engineers. So it's kind of, since it hasn't been used or utilized, to get rid of it. And if we are getting rid of mechanical harvest, might as well get rid of that as well, that option.
I mean, I see where you're coming from, that it probably is not a huge increase in the net.
I was just wondering how, but.
Well, it'd be longer though, presumably you have to have a period of time before they begin dredging. Dredging is constrained in time already by sensitive habitat things, and so it would extend that period long by a little bit.
Oh, so they come in before the maintenance dredging?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so I was imagining somehow, I didn't understand.
They're not
the
intercepting
process.
the clams.
That's what I was
They're
thinking.
coming
They're taking the
before.
clams
I
out
understand.
before
Yeah.
they're dredged.
Okay,
Presumably not long before, and presumably still within the window.
I understand now.
With the communication and all
Difficult.
that, it's
Difficult coordination.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Hate to call out your names, Lisa and Kate. Do you have any, or do you, Sarah?
I was just gonna add that when we, at our last quarterly meeting, the commission discussed this at length and we felt pretty comfortable with the gradual phase out and eliminating dredging, and because there was also stakeholder input on that. And there was a comfort level with that, so.
It just was, my own opinion, I agree with what the commission did, and it's a good opportunity in some ways to, at a time when it's not to the detriment, significant detriment of more than just a few people, to preclude the development of some larger fishery in the future that we might have trouble in managing. We already have a significant challenge, in my view, about the aggregate number of leases and how much habitat and, for that matter, sediment and other disturbance is going on in the lease bottom. And to add this to that is a significant amount. I think it's a good opportunity. I don't hear any other questions. Why don't we, Jesse, can we take the public comment now?
Can I ask a question?
Okay, yes, state your name, please.
Nancy Eden.
Okay.
On the maintenance stretch, you said there was limited interest. There'd be limited interest. So that's not completely true, because a few years ago, when they were dredging in the New River, and I questioned it, why weren't we allowed to plan before they dredged? I talked to the people at Marine Fisheries, I talked to the Corps of Engineers, I even talked to the company that was doing the dredging, and I don't have all my notes here from that. Didn't think about that. But what I was told was it was a lack of communication between the company, the Corps of Engineers, and the Marine Fisheries. So those clams were lost. And what you asked a while ago too, those clams will be lost ahead of dredging if we're not allowed to do it. Another question, on one of the slides, it said the sedimentation smothers. Well, in New River, the areas are flip-flop, which you know, in front of the landing this one year, the next year is down the canal. Well, every year we can get our limit. So actually it's not smothering a lot of plants. No more than the shells. The shells don't usually smother, but the rocks, we think the rock that you're putting over is not as good as the shells, and it does more harm. What's your thought on that, on the rock, on the smothering?
That's pertaining to the coach program.
Yes.
So for the coach program, we have a rigorous site selection process, where we'll go and visit each site, and we'll take, tongs, and we'll get sediment, and we'll look for existing shell in those areas. In our current permit, which is a Army Corps nationwide 27 permit, that doesn't allow us to plant material down where there is existing shell. That's for oysters and clams. So those are valuable habitat that we recognize. And so we're not planning on any area where there's shells or subaquatic vegetation.
Well, when you plant the rock, how soon do you go back and check to see?
Those are monitored for 3 years, every year for 3 years.
Do you see a lot of growth from that?
Oh, from the oysters? Yeah.
From the rock?
Yeah, the oysters are growing quite well in the rock that we plant.
And on the recreational license for the clams and oysters, I don't think there's that many oysters caught recreational, as many as there are clams. Because in the summertime, you have more people out, more people in the water, playing with their hands, with their rakes, whatever. And there's more clams caught at that time than any other time. And I think it needs to be monitored. I do agree.
Thank you very much. So since we've entered this part of it, let's just see if anybody else in the audience or online either signed up or is interested in making a short statement, public comment to the advisory committee, or has a question for our expert.
I think that's it, Doug.
Okay, just be clear. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, so why don't we move, if there are no further questions, then let's move forward on to the next part of the agenda, which is to recommend action to the commission on each of the two matters. And just as I think the easiest way to proceed, you know, obviously you can move it whatever you want to move, but the easiest way to proceed is to take the division's recommendations, realizing that those have also been blessed by the Marine Fisheries Commission and are out for review from otherwise as a starting point. And so if there is, unless there is a proposal to not support one of those, then I think the easiest thing to do would be to take all of them together and support them if we do, and then add to that other issues we might want to prioritize or other things. And so that's just my feeling about it, relatively straightforward. straightforward way to go through this. So you've heard, this, do you have the, oyster recommendations back up on the board? So you can be-
They were just there. Yeah, they're all, each, strategy has its own slide for recommendations, so we don't have one where they're all together, but.
Would you just reiterate what those are?
Yeah, so for, recreational harvest, and this, issue applies to both clam and oysters, so you could do it together for clam and oyster if you wanted to. The division supports the recommendation. Divisions requesting the commission support the division to further explore potential options and develop a solution to quantify recreational shellfish harvest and participation in landings, and to establish a mechanism to provide all recreational shellfish harvesters with shellfish sanitation and recreational water quality, health, and safety information outside of the FMP process. So basically, looking for the commission to give us the blessing to move forward and explore any and all options to kind of fill this data gap.
So what we might do, again, I'm not putting words in you now, what we might do is support this and as a step towards the development of adequate information to identify and adopt appropriate harvest goals and stock assessments for future management or something like that along the lines of what we discussed before. Which would be probably what I would support.
So on this is where we would recommend a recreational regulation or license required for harvest, correct? It doesn't specifically say.
Right, that's one of the mechanisms, but
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to propose it as that we would support, you certainly can do that. But if you have a second and enough votes, we'll make that recommendation.
License always comes with a fee.
Of course.
And
It's a complicated issue.
Yeah, but there's other models for like I'm thinking of if you just want information. There's the harvest identification program for taking migratory birds. There's that. I mean, there's other models for things that don't come with a cost. I'm thinking about people that go out. I'm actually thinking about shrimpers mostly. Subsistence. Think about the North River Bridge during the summer. You see people out there that are catching food and may or may not, I don't know how much they make, but I don't know. I'm just thinking about people who might not shoulder the burden of a $20 per year license very well yet.
Yeah, I think the division is very.
But at the same time, you got to have the information. I get it.
Right, and so that's the primary goal of this recommendation is information that you need for effective management. That's the goal of it, which I personally support.
Yeah.
And but if you want to propose something incremental to that, then we can discuss it.
Well, the way it's written doesn't say anything about money.
Well, all it says is further potential options and solutions to quantify.
Yeah,
that.
which I totally agree with.
So if I were wordsmithing, I would put a comma at the end of that and after landings and say, in order to move forward with developing appropriate oyster, I would say oyster and probably hard clam stock assessment in the future. And then say semicolon, and to establish a mechanism to provide all recreational shellfish harvesters with health and safety information. Something like that.
So basically, to adding 2 words, stock assessment, in addition
In
to.
pursuit of appropriate stock assessment and management targets or something.
That would cover it.
Operator Lisa has her hand up.
Oh, Lisa?
Yes, thank you. I agree with these comments. I also had the same thoughts and considerations for subsistence fishers in this area, and I agree with the importance of getting the information out there. Might there be an opportunity to provide some sort of, contingency for subsistence fishers at a reduced rate or a free license, waiving the license fee basically for subsistence fishers?
I believe that all of that stuff, would necessarily be considered, and particularly when there are licenses and fees, as a division moves to develop any of these things, including the creation of, categories, sort of, de minimis use that is socially and economically important. And that all of that would be wrapped into their exploration of potential options. And we can do that, Lisa, if you have anything specific that you would like to recommend.
I just want to add, currently for the coastal recreational fishing license, there is a provision for a subsistence waiver. So if you don't make X amount of money, it's a free license, so you don't need to pay. So for instance, if, we ended up getting our shellfish species wrapped into the existing coastal recreational fishing license, there's already that provision there for subsistence fishing. And so there's already a mechanism there for doing something like that. So it wouldn't be impossible. And if it was wrapped into the coastal fishing license, recreational fishing license, it'd be built in already.
Awesome, thanks.
Dr. Rader,
Yes,
it's wrapped into all hunting and fishing.
necessarily, right? It's in the statute.
And it's handled through social services, each county social service.
That's from the mouth of the expert. Okay, well, let's look at the other ones and maybe we can accomplish this in one motion. Other recommendations?
Yep. So the next one, for the mechanical harvest strategy for those deep water oyster recovery areas, the preliminary division recommendation is to adopt the deep water oyster recovery areas as outlined in the appendix.
Okay, and
for strategy 2, the culture supported harvest, the division's preliminary recommendation is to adopt the proposed culture supported harvest strategy as outlined in the appendix.
right, and
Adopt the rotational culture site strategy.
And again, my view on that, just for the record, is that these are pilot scale programs. To look at how to do it with 4 in each of the zones, so 16.
And if assuming the strategy 2 is adopted, then adaptive management framework for that strategy.
Okay. I wonder maybe we are. So how do you want to proceed? Would someone like to make a motion related to this, relative to the division's recommendations?
I think from the stance of Habitat, they're all firm measures to be taken.
Are you making a motion, Scott?
Yeah, make a motion that we
Adopt these as
adopt
proposed with the addition of the targeting of a stock assessment in the first that we discussed.
statewide stock assessment. Yeah.
Is that
Jesse,
clear
did you
enough?
get that?
Is that clear enough, Jesse and Hope?
You're muted, Jesse.
Yeah, give me 1 second to get the motion screen shared.
So Scott, I'm not sure I understood that, to adopt all of the, that we
Yes.
saw in yellow?
Yeah, I mean, aside from the economic factors and social factors, I think from the stance of habitat, water quality, they're all solid measures which are taking those things in consideration.
Just make sure that just if your motion is captured. I would have said, Jesse, the stock assessment and stock level management or something. And
Just for clams, not for oysters also.
Well, this is for the oysters.
yeah,
I'm sorry, just for oysters, not.
Yeah,
although he said he could use it for both, and I personally would support move towards it for both.
If they're both so closely related.
Just a moment. So, is there a second to this motion? Never discuss it.
I would second this motion.
Okay, Kate, second by Kate.
So before we move on, there is one thing that I need to clarify in this motion is that the recreational shellfish license isn't actually part of the mechanical harvest management issue paper. So I just need to do a little bit of wordsmithing to make sure that that's clear in this motion. If y'all give me 1 second.
Okay, but Mark, you want to ask a question?
Yes, if they're so closely related, and yet we don't have the full data on both oysters and clams. And one of the recommendations when we get to clam is to do a 3-year phase out. Why then are oysters treated so differently when they are so close together and we're still looking for data on both?
So I think the difference between the clam and the oyster issue as far as phasing it out as an option and keeping it open with these stipulations outlined in the mechanical issue paper is that the participation in the oyster fishery is a lot more than that of clam. Additionally, there's the enforcement costs with clam that we're worried about. So they both share this, you know, the as you pointed out, the worry of damage to bottom habitat, but the two other stipulations are for clam are participation and the enforcement side of things.
Right, but should that enforcement side of things make a decision of what is best for the water quality and habitat? I mean, it can still be a part of it, even if law enforcement is a challenge. Law enforcement for all this is a challenge. There are not enough marine patrolmen out there, except the ones that stop me going through the Morehead City turning basin. But besides that area, I mean, there's already not enough law enforcement for all the programs. Why would we make a decision based on there's not enough money for law enforcement? I mean, it should still be on the books. Whether or not it can be enforced or not may be another story. And that's for another department to handle.
And I expect that they will come back to us with better recommendation how to move forward on oysters, on hard clams, or on both in terms of what the mechanisms might be. We've left all of that to be elaborated and then evaluated, and that would come back to the public and to the commission for decision. This is about information gathering for the development of effective management based on better knowledge about how much we use. And I think that's true really for
I think I can sum up or answer your question on why the.
About why I'm stopped at the Morehead City turning basin?
No, it's going too fast. No, for the 3-year phase out, and when we're talking about oysters, the oyster then can still go and harvest in other areas. So there's no need to have a 3-year phase out versus hard clam, where we're essentially telling if you are doing hydraulic dredging, that fishery is going to end for the time being. So we're essentially telling people that fishery, that gear, that vessel in 3 years' time is no longer going to be available for use.
And remember, we haven't addressed that issue yet.
Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet.
We'll get to that piece next.
So then we should maybe omit, well, I mean, it's great to have more information for both. But then if we're just asking for more information on clams, as well as oysters here, if we then get to the clam decision and decide if that happens for the 3-year phase out, then people can go back to this saying, hey, we're just gathering information. You can't vote for both.
If it would be clearer to you, it's my fault that we have combined these things, to look at them separately, that would be fine. You know, or alternatively, we can break the
Split
sentence.
it up,
And
it'll be clear,
That's fine, just remove claim from this one.
or, yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and the only reason I put that back in there was the idea that they will combine them and coming back to look at the governance, meaning the licensing or permitting options are. And they're likely to do that for both, not for one or the other. So as long as we support that, it doesn't really matter. You want to just take the clam out of this, just to be clear, Jesse, if you haven't already. Well, you said recreational shellfish, that's fine.
So what I currently have in this motion here is the mechanical oyster harvest management issues. So the deep water oyster recovery areas, the culture supported harvest, and the rotational culture sites for oyster, as well as the recreational shellfish harvest that would apply to both oyster and clam. But there isn't anything about the phase out of the mechanical clam harvest in this motion. I have it written on the screen.
So can we have both if we get to that in the clams? That it be listed here under recreational shellfish, and then also possibly
Well, I
include
think
the
when we
phase.
get to clams, you can assume that our recommendation of the commission relative to that part is already dealt with. We can just move to the other outstanding issues.
Okay.
Is that okay, Mark?
Straight ahead.
Okay. Is this language okay with Scott? Thumbs up on that, and with the second. Yes. Okay, any other discussion about this motion? Okay, hearing none, roll call votes, please, Jesse.
Certainly. Miss Arnold?
Aye.
Mr. Durham? Mr. Glenn?
Aye.
Mr. Podry? Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Mr. Leahy?
Aye.
Mr. Parrish? Miss Ryder?
Aye.
Mr. Sonder?
Aye.
Commissioner Gardner?
Aye.
And Commissioner Rader?
Aye, and the ayes have it on that motion. Now, to the staff, are there other things related to Eastern Oyster that we have neglected? Or Jesse, or someone to fact check, make sure we've done what we need to do there? Okay, are there other things we've talked about that you would like to memorialize in a recommendation to the Marine Fisheries Commission related to oysters? I'm gonna ask you some questions after we finish claims, so about the habitat issues related to all of them.
I mean, for myself, I would just like to see a statewide assessment in the works, obviously not tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's clear both in the language and the intent. Yeah. Anything else? Mark?
Sorry.
No.
When we were doing clams,
Glad you participated, thank you.
when we were doing clams, Lorena had talked about the graph with the black line going down, and you were going to answered my question that it's gone down because of the market has less of an interest. Yet you said there's much more substantial use in harvesting of oysters, but I remember in a similar chart there was also a black line that went very much in a descending line. Was that because of less market interest as well? Yet there's supposedly more oysters that are being harvested, et cetera, et cetera. So
when you start breaking it down and looking at it kind of by harvest method, so mechanical harvest oyster landings have dropped way down. And that's participation has dropped, but also participation and the landings have dropped. So since we don't have a fisheries independent abundance index, I can't tell you that the amount of oysters out there has dropped, therefore landings and participation have dropped, or there's just less people doing it, so less oyster are landed. But I can tell you that we are seeing in those deep water reefs, the condition of those reefs is really bad. And the season lengths have been really short outside of, because how it's managed now, there's a 6-week window that those shallow areas around Pamlico Sound and the bays can be fished. So that's really driving the landings. That's where most of the effort's happening. So once those areas close, those deeper areas of Pamlico Sound and the Neuse River, Pamlico River, Neuse River area, there just hasn't been anything out there. So there's really not any landings. The hand harvest landings, they've stayed relatively consistent through time, just soldiering on, kind of really supporting the overall amount of oysters landed from public bottom. When you take a step out and look at overall oyster landings from public and private bottom, it's skyrocketed, and the proportion from leases, private bottom, just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So I forget when the first year it flip-flopped. 2017, 2010, somewhere. It flipped where it used to be consistently, Wild Harvest was driving the fishery with this little teeny piece of lease landings, and then it flopped where there was way more landed than from private and public, and then it's just gone ever since.
So then I'm unclear still, I'm sorry, why it makes a significant drop even on your graph. On the landings for oysters. Following that black line.
The Wild Harvest.
This one.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be. Could you bring up the pocket size for me?
Yeah, give me 1 second. But before I bring that up, Doug, I do want to make one clarifying thing. That the motion that was just passed, it didn't specifically mention anything about adopting adaptive management in it. That was one of the division's recommendations if the culch supported harvest was adopted. Would it be possible, if the committee's in support of it, to just have a motion clarifying that, having a motion saying that y'all do support adaptive management, if that's what y'all support?
It was intended to.
It was
Jesse, is
intended
there
to.
any disagreement with intending with by consensus, Jesse, that you're welcome to add that into the list?
All right, perfect.
Is that
and I will get the slides pulled up, Joe.
I think Lisa, that's a new hand.
Lisa?
Oh, thanks. While he's working on this motion, I just wanted to make a really quick comment and thank the staff for bringing this presentation to us and providing the documents well in advance for us to read through. And I just want to say that this strategy definitely supports the goal of this committee and, supporting restoration and sustainable harvest. And I think that it also echoes the need for more research. And I certainly want to elevate the need for expanding monitoring efforts and establishing sentinel sites, which are going to be critical to validating the success of these strategies, both, now and in the future. And so I just want to say, if there's any way that we can sort of elevate this up the chain to be able to properly fund some of these efforts in the future. Thank you.
Would you like to propose something while you've got the floor? Well, we're in the business of making motions right now, Lisa. I support what you're suggesting. In fact, I would support the identification of priority needs and resources to fill those needs related to the development of long-term oyster, and for that matter, oyster and hard clam and estuarine habitat abundance relative to the overall ecosystem needs in North Carolina.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to need some more funding for this. The DMF's going to need more staff. And there's going to need to be some enhanced research partnerships that can strengthen this, this process. So, absolutely.
Okay, why don't you
whatever
hold-
wording feels appropriate.
Hold on to that for a moment until we finish answering Mark's question, Jesse, if you've got the, if somebody has a.
So there, that's, a figure that's in the appendix there that we didn't show in the presentation, but that dotted line is the hand harvest landings of oyster for public bottom. So pretty consistent throughout time, a couple little bumps here and there, but it's been the southern region, the intertidal oysters really have been supporting kind of a consistent harvest throughout time. And that's gone back in time. It goes back. But when you look at that gray line, this gray solid line, that's the mechanical harvest from Pamlico Sound oysters on public bottom. You can see it really drops there after 2010. That was a peak when, to get into that fishery, you did not need a standard commercial fishing license. You could use the shellfish only license. And that license is open to any resident of the state. So there's no cap on that. Anyone could get in. So a lot of people got in to take advantage of kind of this patch of oysters that was found out there, as well as really high market prices at the time. So it really drove people just jumping in there. And in response to that, the legislature actually acted and removed mechanical gear as an eligible gear from that shellfish only license. So when you see that big drop, that's everyone that's dropped out after in 2012, when that was in effect, where you needed to have a standard commercial fishing license to use mechanical gear. But you can still see it's dropped out. And when it really dropped out in 2018-19, that's the impact of those hurricanes, those low dissolved oxygen events really kind of impacting the oyster resource, particularly in that deep water area. So again, it's tough because looking at landings data, it's not the whole picture because it's not consistent. The season isn't the same length every year, and the season length is driven by the oyster resource condition, and landings are driven by participation. So either people are just not participating because the oysters aren't there, or it's just not worth their time, or a little bit of both. But we do have the bit of data we have from our monitoring program shows that the condition of the oysters in those deep areas after 2018 really were degraded. So we can start to see some landings coming up, and those, if you look at the season lengths, they've been lasting longer and longer since then.
So if you went to the left on that time series, that's an artificial peak. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's like the peak in the fishery. I think in the data we have to 94, back to 94. Is when everyone just jumped in there, when you could get.
But the numbers in, let's just say from 1990 to 2005 would have been where? In the 40 or 60,000 range, or?
I'd have to go back and look, but I mean, I think it was probably in that like 40 to 60. It was kind of flat bump, but it has been variable throughout time because of that, the vulnerability of those deeper oysters. It's not a new
back to 1880. It would be
huge. Yeah.
Is that clear, Mark, or not?
For the purposes of moving on, I'll say it's clear.
Okay. So do you want, before we come back to clams, Lisa, do you want to take a swat at another motion along the lines of what you were talking about a moment ago?
I mean, I would just add that I move to support the expansion of the monitoring efforts and establishment of sentinel sites as a critical step in validating the success of the proposed fishery management strategies. And I propose that we prioritize proper funding and strategic partnerships within the research institutions and organizations to strengthen decision-making processes.
Lisa, can you say that again a little slower?
Oh, sure. I'm so sorry. Oh my God, what did I say? Support of the expansion of monitoring efforts and the establishment of sentinel sites as a critical step in validating the success of the proposed fishery management strategies. And then I think in addition, prioritize proper funding and strategic partnerships with research institutions and organizations to strengthen these decision-making processes.
And from proper funding,
And
just that last little bit.
And partnerships with research institutions. I think that captures it pretty good. Thanks.
I'll second that.
Okay, any discussion? This seems a no-brainer. Seeing no discussion, let's have a roll call vote, please.
I didn't get who seconded it.
It's Nathan.
Nathan. Hall.
Miss Arnold,
Aye.
Mr. Durham, Mr. Glenn,
Aye.
Mr. Fodry, Mr. Hall,
Aye.
Mr. Leahy,
Aye.
Mr. Parrish, Ms. Ryder, Mr. Sonder,
Aye.
Commissioner Gardner,
Aye.
and Commissioner Rader.
Aye. Motion carries. Okay, and so that brings us back to the issues recommended by the division related to hard claims. You want to put that also on the screen?
I will. Can y'all see that now?
Yes. Okay, you see the recommendation. Is there a motion? Or do you have?
I do have a question.
Further question?
Yeah, Maria, you had given a lot of credence to 1, 2, and 3. And number 4 you just read, but you really did not explain or discuss more about number 4. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about number 4?
Yeah, so the reason behind the reason behind why we are recommending the discontinuance of mechanical harvest prior to maintenance dredging was that it has not been utilized since 2007. And just what we thought was a lack of interest, but there is obviously that communication issue that we have with coordinating with Army Corps of Engineers. Getting notification before those events happen, and then setting those proclamations out for fishermen to be able to do that.
So are you saying it's already on the books since 2007?
It's only been utilized since 2007. This, like the mechanical harvest of clams prior to maintenance dredging. So it's on there as a second recommendation. So if we do this phase out of the mechanical clam harvest, we're also suggesting to discontinue this rule with that. Since we're already discontinuing that year for it to have a rule suspension.
So 3 and 4 essentially is one vote. It's one, if you're voting for 3, you're voting for 4 as well.
That's what we would like, but that doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
And just for clarity, our job in habitat water quality is different than trying to weigh some socioeconomic factors that might really bear some closer scrutiny. And so we actually don't have to make a recommendation if we don't want to, or we could deal with issue 3 and issue 4 only, or
Recommend just 3 and not 4.
yeah, whatever you feel comfortable doing. I'm not going to steer on this one. I've got some mixed opinions personally, so you should consider what you want to recommend, and then someone can make a motion.
Make a motion to follow up on kind of mirroring my earlier comment. as far as the management strategies of definitely number three. As far as, for the environmental factors.
Okay.
And I think, unfortunately, however it works out, I think if you're in the industry, that would ultimately mean you're not gonna chase around dredges in the hopes you're notified in time anyway.
Probably that's true. Okay, got a motion on the floor. Jesse, would you mind trying to capture that? It basically is just to endorse the division's recommendation relative to action number 3.
And who made that motion?
Leahy.
And just to make certain, I have the motion as a motion by Leahy to endorse the division's recommendation in the mechanical clam harvest issue paper, which is options 3 and 4. Is that the motion you made it, Mr. Leahy?
Is that vote?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll second.
There's a second.
Second by?
David?
Who was it by?
Glenn.
Glenn?
All right, thank you.
Okay, questions, comments? Hearing none, roll call vote.
Ms. Arnold?
Aye.
Mr. Durham? Mr. Glenn?
Aye.
Mr. Padre? Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Mr. Leahy?
Aye.
Mr. Parrish? Ms. Ryder?
Aye.
Ms. Sonder?
Aye.
Commissioner Gardner?
Aye.
And Commissioner Rader?
I'll vote aye, and that motion also carries. So before we move on to other issues by the commissioners, are there issues that we have discussed or not discussed and not yet memorialized by these recommendations that you would like to move on to the commission? I can't really think of any on the top of my head. Well, I think it's on the, anybody else wants to propose the motion, maybe other act?
I know we're short on time, but
We
I
are.
know I don't speak up too much, but this concept of the mandatory harvest reporting that we're enacting December 1.
Right.
Does anybody else support the idea of including oysters and clams into that? Is that not feasible? Or when I saw that seemed like a natural fit to me. I tended to be an expert on.
Yeah, I think it is complicated because of the origin of that mandate coming from the General Assembly and the time course of response to that. It's already not resource supported. Colonel?
So for commercial,
But
it
would
will-
you just introduce yourself?
sorry, everybody, I'm Colonel Witten with the Marine Patrol. For commercial, it will include oyster clams. It'll include everything commercially. Recreational is just the 5 recreational or species that they have named, but commercial is everything.
So they don't have the resources as much as my personal view.
Oh, yeah, I understand. I get
do
that.
the job.
Yeah.
But I think what we've already endorsed is a complete exploration of different mechanisms that would allow including those kinds, that would allow the recreation and harvest to be enumerated and the participants counted in them. So I think we've already covered the base, but Phil, if you want to pursue it, you're welcome to make another motion.
Well, I know it doesn't really have to be 27 anyway, but I don't know. It seems natural to me that should be one of the things. If we're trying to get more numbers, then we should say, okay, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Well, okay, so how about just editorially, in terms of the response to recommendation number 1, Sarah and I will forward that on to the commission and discussion to the meeting in February. We'll make sure that the director staff respond to that as one option. Okay. If the person's agreeing.
Yeah.
So after that,
Yes, ma'am.
the mandatory reporting is such a complex issue.
I'm sure.
And it's is legislated to us. We are not putting
Big
it
fight.
forward. And so there's so many things that could and should and be added to this and manipulated. We hear you totally, and I would agree, but it's.
And without getting all the way on the soapbox, I mean, the truth of the matter is the General Assembly has not adequately supported the division and the staff in fulfilling their duties and obligations under the law that currently exist, and including the development of these kinds of programs. And so you share this, Sarah, but every time we get to another species coming before the commission, saying, we don't know this key thing and this key thing and this key thing, and mostly it tracks back to the lack of investment by the state of North Carolina in making realizing the potential of these programs. Sorry about the soapbox. Okay, I think we're done with these two items. Do you have what you need? Okay. So last issue on the agenda is issues from members. And I will just mention one or two things that came up at the commission meeting that is back in our purview, just so you can be thinking about it for later. Actually, I'll just mention, I'll mention two. One is the cumulative effect of bulkheads on the hydrology and ecological conditions in and thus fish production potential of the tidal column in North Carolina, and the incredibly complicated impacts that seem to be being missed when individual permitting site by site doesn't capture the system scale negative effect. So there are a couple of commissioners, not naming names, who really would like us to see if we can work with staff and figure out something. To me, that's complicated as part of it. And obviously, the Coastal Resources Commission does all the regulatory stuff there for most of it. And it's a Coastal Habitat Protection Plan is one way to get at that. The Albemarle Hamilton National Estuary Program Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan is another way to get at that. Or technically, a lot of those are Corps of Engineers permit that federal essential fish habitat. There's a lot of it gets real complicated quick, but that's a set of issues that have come up from the staff. And the second one, just to be thinking about, we didn't actually talk about lease bottom in terms of productivity or habitat effects in aggregate today, but the issues keep coming before the commission related to how many leases should you be having in a creek, both for purposes of interaction among user groups and also for potential habitat effects. So anyway, there's a lot of issues. Does anybody have other things you'd like to just put on the table for us to think about bringing back for discussion later?
Did we get a follow-up of what we were speaking on the last year about the shrimp trawlers versus the SAF? I'm not sure what the final outcome of that was, and if now's not the time to talk about it, just
so at the last meeting we were briefed on the outcome, but not on the and where they're going. So the commission elected not to adopt the proposed areas, but to instead continue looking at, as part of an amendment to the SHRIP. So they felt like there were a lot of other irons in that fire, and that looking at how to protect SAB habitat requires a broader look again at the mechanisms that are available. So they came back at the last meeting and explained some of the governance op handles that were available. And that was the first step towards a process that will be interactive back to us to consider options. My own personal opinion is that we ought to move forward identifying SAB ecosystem areas spatially and formally adopt those and then submit them for protection for all commissions that have the rulemaking authority. On using the same model that the primary and secondary nursery area designations by this commission then led to the Management Commission adopting water quality standards, and the Coastal Resources Commission adopting development standards, and cascading all the way up to federal essential fish habitat was quite the area for the highest tier of federal habitat protection follows that pathway. And so it already does in terms of SAB itself theoretically, but by not being delineated in terms specifically that way, we have all the definitions. I think we could, among other things, look at adopting a set of SAB habitat areas that would have be delineated like the maps we saw, and then it becomes a matter of whether and how you manage fishing and non-fishing threats together in a series of different actions. So it's an ongoing process.
So
Is that right, Sarah?
presently it's more monitoring and then it'll get kicked back to us.
No,
again.
the staff is actively developing recommendations to follow up. In other words, the commission did not just say go home. They basically said this may not be the right mechanism to look only at basically small boat shrimpers that way and omit all of the other threats as they be in those places. That a more holistic consideration of different government channels might have us take a different. That was we didn't have the votes actually to get it adopted. And so they'll come back, hopefully in a couple of different stages with more and more specific recommendations that we'll have an opportunity to comment on and make it recommendations to the commission.
This year, you think?
Should be this year that you'll hear at least something from us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was that a fair?
That was very good. Yeah.
Okay.
You have a question, a question and potential that could lead to a potential issue. Is there a way to describe the difference between an oyster sanctuary, a natural reef, a culture planning, and like a culture fortified reef? And what is in terms of maybe how, and then what a sentinel site is, and would a sentinel site be strictly a natural reef, or would that be one that's been enhanced? What's the personality of each one of these, and potentially which one of these could we look at as a potential water quality chip issue, something to maybe push forward a little more quickly. We talked about funding, Lisa, with what she was talking about. Is there a way to just quickly describe the personality of each one of those?
Yeah, so I'll just give you the basic definition. I'm not trying to talk down or anything like that, or I'm just assuming that nobody knows anything about these different reef types that we have. So the sanctuaries are built with the intent that they're closed completely to any sort of harvest, shellfish harvest, specifically oysters. So those are built with fairly large rocks of aggregate material. So they are more or less self-regulated, but mechanical harvesters won't want to drag their gear across these sites because it will get damaged. Poach sites are built with the intent of more or less what Joe is alluding to, that the habitat is equal to the fishery value, whereas the sanctuaries were valuing the habitat more so than the fishery value. So with the poach sites, those are built with the intent of in the future being harvested, and those are built with like golf ball size material. It's all marl limestone for the most part. And then we have our natural reefs where there's no enhancement. I'm not entirely sure what you were referring to with culture fortified.
Well, it sounded like I was hearing reefs and culture kind of being used kind of at the same time, so I wasn't sure if that was actually a thing.
So it does get blurry, particularly in Pamlico Sound culture planting's been going on for decades, right? At this point, there's a lot of reefs that are naturalized that look, like it's a wild reef, but if you went back far enough in time, you can actually see, oh, that was from a culture planting that we did. So it's become a natural reef essentially. So that's where it gets blurry around Pamlico Sound, where I think the intent of kind of the management strategies proposed is to kind of focus mechanical harvest on seed culture planted areas where we could support that harvest by replacing material. But again, around Pamlico Sound, those shallow areas, what is a culture reef, and especially historic, is really blurry. So it may become naturalized.
I think in the deep water, it's a similar question where the step that we're recommending the commission take now would establish for now de facto sanctuaries in the deep water, but that would require some set of interventions to bring towards more natural high relief structure, because it doesn't exist. It's been almost all eliminated both by deaths in place and long-term dredging all the way back to the 19th century. It eliminated those reefs. So if we want deep water reefs to be sustaining given environmental conditions, whether or not they ultimately might be open to some harvest, or some of whom which might be open to some harvest, then that requires a time intervention. But maybe time's not enough. I mean, maybe it takes more than that to get it through a critical verticality or something. So I think that's blurry until we get more knowledge about what actually happens in Pamlico Sound. It's pretty different, I think, than Chesapeake Bay.
And sentinel sites are just sites that were selected in the intertidal region as kind of representative oyster reefs that are monitored through time, so you can see changes in density, abundance, footprint, just as fixed areas that are, the goal is that they represent the entire kind of intertidal region.
But at some point, Sarah, I think you're right. I mean, you can imagine a three-dimensional map of Pamlico Sound that identifies the habitat values today, in the past, today, and in the future, that add up together towards a cumulative yes in each of these key habitat compartments. At that point, we would need to know, how much more we need and where could it be for the key undervalued habitat component. But and I do think that the CHIP creates and for that matter, the CCNP and HABNEP create the vehicles that we could pursue those things. But we're a long way from information being able to do that. But you could basically zone uses, and you could do all of these things. Remember that our fishery management plans have for convenience been species oriented, but it doesn't require it. The law allows you to take any combination of species, gears, and areas. So we could have a Pamlico Sound fishery management plan, multi-species plan, that was undergirded by overlays of habitat expectations and that matched up to uses on the opportunity side and on the liability side. That could be done with an adequate resource. Does that answer the question at all? Is there a short-term step that you would like staff to bring back to us? Beyond what you've heard?
No, that was good start, just good homework for me.
Anybody else? Lisa, Kate?
No, thanks.
Okay.
All good.
Well, thank you all for your time. This has been, I think, a main important step forward. I appreciate it and look forward to seeing you. Oh, right, Jesse wants one more. Do you want one more bite at the apple, Jesse?
I'll try to make it quick, even though I love long meetings. So I might just ramble. I'm not sure. We'll see. I wanted to just talk to y'all briefly about kind of the 2025 meeting schedule and some ideas that we had for meetings. I think we're gonna try to start having one virtual meeting prior to the actual meetings that y'all have where you deliberate and vote on an issue. So, for example, if we had done it with the oyster claim topics that y'all voted on tonight, we would have had a virtual meeting, say about a week ago, where at that virtual meeting, you would have received the presentations that you got tonight, and you would have had the chance to ask the questions about the presentations at that virtual meeting. And this virtual meeting would be a meeting with all of the ACs. It would be the Habitat and Water Quality AC, the Northern AC, the Southern AC, all of the relevant ACs for the topic at hand. You would receive the presentation and have the ability to ask questions at that meeting. And then the following week, you would actually have an in-person meeting where you deliberate on the different options and you ultimately vote on your recommendation. We really hope that it gives the advisory committee members a little bit more time to really digest the information. Like, we realized that, especially this one tonight, there was 2 different fisheries management plans that y'all had to vote on, and that's a lot of information to get through in 2 or 2.5 hours. So we really hope that with this strategy, the AC members can receive that presentation, have a little bit of time to mull it over in their head, maybe talk to some folks, reach out to staff and ask any of the questions that y'all have that you maybe didn't think of in the moment during the meeting, and then come back to the table a week later at the in-person meeting where you will be a little bit more ready to proceed forward with your recommendation. So I think the next set of meetings coming up this spring, we're going to try that approach.
That sounds good to me. It means it would also save time for us when we're face to face to begin wrestling with some of these longer term issues that we brought up. Sounds good, Jesse. Anything else?
I believe that's all I have, Doug.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay, well, thank you again for coming, and we all appreciate your time. And,
thank you again for the presentation.
This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Good job, man.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh my God.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate it.
Great job on your first meeting.
Thank you. It was pretty exciting. Can't wait to be there in person next time.
Gotta go to Boyd and Peter
Yeah, like I said, I normally just like it.
One of these people who threw that recently this fall. So I thought it was
Mostly.